This is part 2 of the PowerPoint for chapters 21 and 22. And we left off on the last section on this slide here, which was showing the relationship between human chromosome 16 and the 4 chromosomes you see here belonging to the mouse genome, and how the genes are related, and the theory here being that the divergence between different species of mammals occurred in the evolutionary history by the breaking up, in this case, of chromosomes. So the rate of duplications and inversions seems to have accelerated about 100 million years ago, which coincides with when the large dinosaurs went extinct and mammals diversified. And these chromosomal rearrangements are thought to contribute to the generation of new species. So how that occurs partly is when we have unequal crossing over during prophase 1 of meiosis. We can end up with one chromosome that has a deletion and another that has a duplication of a particular region. These transposable elements can provide sites for crossover also between non-sister chromatids. So gene duplication again can occur due to unequal crossing over. And this is just a diagram showing how that can occur. So in this case we have the tetrad and we have the homologous set of chromosomes with uneven crossing over. But the different scenario is when we have this same crossing over idea occurring between different chromosomes that are not homologous, and that's when we have the transposable elements or transposons actually doing the same sort of crossing over, which can be equal or unequal. The result that we get is genes possibly that can code for entirely different things. So this is a comparison of lysozyme and the lactalbumin protein. And the copies of some duplicated genes have diverged so much between these two that the function has now become very different. So what we see here in this sequencing is not actual base pairs, these are actually the gene sequences. And you can see here how there is divergence between the two and where there are similarities as well. So the yellow portion shows all the similarities, and then the unhighlighted portions are where we have divergence. So what's believed to have occurred here is that the lysozyme gene was duplicated and evolved into the gene that encodes now for alpha-lactalbumin in mammals. And the functioning of these genes through these changes actually did preserve functioning proteins. But in this case, lysozyme is an enzyme that helps protect animals against a bacterial infection, whereas the now mutated and divergent alpha-lactalbumin is not an enzymatic protein. It actually plays a role in milk production in mammals. So what are transposable elements? These are again, transposons. We've touched on this in previous units, but just to review it, they are transposable elements, portions of genes that move from one section, pick up and move to another, either on the same chromosome or onto a different chromosome. Basically, they are any sort of section of DNA that carries a gene or a group of genes to a new position. So multiple copies of similar transposable elements may actually facilitate recombination or crossing over between different chromosomes. An insertion of a transposable element may actually block the original protein's production, or it may increase that protein production or decrease it if it occurs within a regulatory sequence. But basically, these transposable elements are usually producing changes that are detrimental. But once in a while, you're going to have an advantageous mutation occur through this process. So on to chapter 22. Chapter 22 is looking at the history, basic history of natural selection and the theory of evolution developed by Charles Darwin. So some of the foundational theories start with Cuvier, who was an anatomist who studied fossils, and he noted that the older strata has different organisms in it. So instead of evolution, Cuvier advocated catastrophism, which speculated that the boundaries between the strata were due to local floods or droughts, some sort of catastrophe that destroyed the species. He then theorized that the denuded areas were repopulated by species immigrating from unaffected areas. Some other theories, there was Hutton, who was a geologist, and he proposed a theory of gradualism, which held that a profound geologic change takes place through a cumulative effect of slow but continuous processes identical to what is currently occurring. So an example of this, again, this is geology based, so we have a physical formation of valleys occurring as a result of rivers flowing through rocks and sedimentary rocks that are formed from soil particles that have eroded from the land. This is the theory of gradualism. Lyell is another geologist who proposed a theory of uniformitarianism, which is that geologic processes have not changed throughout the history of Earth. So Hutton and Lyell's observations and theories had a strong influence on Darwin. He really had a strong background in geology and relied on these previous theories. He believed that if geologic changes resulted from slow, continuous processes rather than a sudden event, then the Earth had to be a lot older than the 6,000 years that was estimated at the time. And he also concluded that slow and subtle processes persisting for long periods of time can also act on the living organisms over that time and produce a substantial change over that period of time. So this was in contrast to a very popular belief at the time proposed by Lamarck. Lamarck believed that organisms simply adapted to their environments by acquiring a trait. So this was something that was not a gradual change that was occurring. This is something that would occur within a generation. So change within the lifetime would be passed on to the next generation. He was the first to state that descent with modification does occur and that organisms become adapted to their environments. And he did this by examining fossil invertebrates in Paris's Natural History Museum. And what he found were several lines of descent, when he was looking at the current and the old species, noting some gradual changes. And he noted how well adapted organisms were to their environments, believing that fossils could be understood as less perfect forms which had perished in the struggle for increasing perfection. So he explained adaptation as a result of change caused by an environmental pressure. Part of what he based this on is that disuse occurred where organisms lost parts because they didn't use them, like missing eyes in the digestive system of a tapeworm, or that if something was used or needed more, it was perfected, that the constant use of a body part leads to an increase in size or strength. And a perfect example of this is if someone is into bodybuilding and weightlifting, their muscles increase. In his case, he observed the muscles of a blacksmith, someone who uses and needs those muscles. therefore they enlarge, um, or